In 2014, Darren Spivey, a 35-year-old scuba diving enthusiast, wanted to share his passion with his 15-year-old son, Dylan. On Christmas Eve, Darren gave Dylan scuba tanks as an early present. They were both excited to use them, planning a dive for the next morning. On Christmas morning, Darren and Dylan set out to a local dive site, but found the gate locked. Determined to dive, Darren decided to take them to another site in central Florida, located in a wildlife management area that was open to hunters, hikers, and divers all day. They drove to the park entrance and found it open. After suiting up in their wetsuits and scuba gear, they headed down a wooden walkway that led to a pond. As they walked down the wooden walkway, they passed several signs warning against diving in the pond unless you were an expert. This pond was the entrance to the infamous and dangerous Eagle's Nest, known as the Mount Everest of cave diving. At the bottom of this calm-looking pond was a narrow hole that led to a massive underwater cave system. Expert divers would follow a guideline down into the cave, swimming until the light above them faded into darkness. Once through the tunnel, divers entered a vast chamber called the ballroom. In this space, if you shined your light in any direction, you wouldn't see a wall. It was that enormous. Divers often said it felt like being in outer space. The guideline continued down to the bottom of the ballroom, about 130 feet deep, where a sign with a grim reaper warned, "Stop, prevent your own death. Do not go any further." This was the last easy point to turn back. Beyond this sign, the cave split into narrower tunnels, reaching depths of 300 feet. The dangers increased significantly beyond this point. A current ran through Eagle's Nest, which could blow divers off the guideline, making it nearly impossible to find the way out in the pitch black. Many divers had died attempting these dives. The sign was a stark warning against life-threatening risks. Despite these warnings, Darren and Dylan, standing at the end of the walkway, were ready to dive. Neither was an expert. Dylan wasn't even a certified diver, and this was one of his first dives. Before diving in, Darren texted his fiancée, saying they were at Eagle's Nest and about to dive, promising to call when they surfaced. He then put his phone away, and they jumped into the water, swimming towards the cave entrance. Hours passed without a call from Darren. As the sun set, his fiancée grew worried and drove to Eagle's Nest. Seeing Darren's car but no sign of them, she called the police. Professional divers were quickly dispatched to search the cave. The search divers descended into the tunnel and entered the ballroom, scanning the ceiling near the entrance with their flashlights. They soon found Dylan's lifeless body trapped against the ceiling, his emergency flotation devices inflated, his mouthpiece out, and his tanks empty. After retrieving Dylan's body, they continued down the guideline to the ballroom's bottom, where they found Darren on a sandy hill near the Grim Reaper sign, his mouthpiece out and tanks empty. Both Darren and Dylan's gauges showed they had descended to 230 feet. For context, depths between 0 and 130 feet are considered recreational diving. Below that, you need special training, equipment, and a different gas mix to breathe. Unfortunately, neither Darren nor Dylan had these essentials. After an investigation, it was determined that their deaths were accidental. The theory was that they entered the ballroom, went down one of the side tunnels, and reached 230 feet. At that depth, they likely experienced nitrogen narcosis, a condition similar to being drunk. Disoriented, they lost track of time and their air supply. As they attempted to return to the surface, they ran out of air. Dylan probably ran out first and showed his father his empty gauge. Darren likely gave his son his regulator so they could share air as they ascended. However, Darren's air supply soon ran out as well, causing him to pass out and sink to the bottom. Dylan, with one last breath of air, tried to swim to the surface, inflating his emergency flotation devices to go faster. In his panic, he must have let go of the guideline, swam up, and hit the ceiling. Unable to find the exit, he ultimately drowned. Despite the numerous warnings, inexperienced divers continue to venture into Eagle's Nest, and fatalities keep occurring. To date, 11 people have died inside that cave.
On 6th February 2014, 2 divers cut a triangular hole in the ice at Plura and, encased in waterproof dry suits and diving equipment, slipped into the water. 2 hours later, after the sediment raised by the first divers had been allowed to settle. 3 of their friends followed behind. All 5 individuals shared a common destination, Steinugelflaget. Among them were Patrick Gronkvist, Jari Huotarinen, Vesa Rantanen, Jari Uzimaki, and Kai Kankinen. These divers had formed acquaintances through their explorations in the Ojamo mine, situated to the west of Helsinki. Following their customary practice, there was no designated leader among them. However, Patrick Gronkvist, one of the trio that had uncovered the passage connecting the caves the previous year, took the lead for this expedition. He was accompanied by his close friend Jari Huotarinen, who was attempting the traverse for the first time. The trip was at the extreme end of a dangerous sport. Unlike the typical amateur diver who might engage in dives lasting between 30 minutes to an hour, the trip to Steinugelflaget would be a 5-hour dive with the aid of underwater scooters. At such depths and temperatures, a tear in a dry suit on the sharp cave floor could result in death. There is also the possibility of equipment failure and hypercapnia, carbon dioxide poisoning, because carbon dioxide absorbs into the bloodstream much faster and easier at depths. Cave divers use rebreathers, which artificially absorb the carbon dioxide they exhale, but these can become overloaded if the divers start breathing quickly, and at depth it is more difficult for them to control their breathing. Hypercapnia can be deadly, but even a mild case may cause confusion and disorientation, which, in a deep cave, is liable to have serious consequences. Approximately 1 hour into the dive, just after navigating and descending to a point approximately 110 meters below the Plura cave entrance, Gronkvist had a realization. Huotarinen was no longer behind. He went back and discovered that his friend had encountered difficulties in a confined area of the cave. Huotarinen was stuck in a narrow section, entangled in a cord linked to a component of his equipment, and was signaling distress with his torch. Huotarinen seemed to be starting to panic, which meant he risked breathing too fast. Gronkvist gave him a cylinder of gas to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in his system, but while Huotarinen was switching mouthpieces, he started helplessly swallowing water. To Gronkvist's horror, his friend died in front of his eyes, but getting agitated would put Gronkvist himself at risk of hypercapnia. After a brief effort to free the body, he forced himself to calm down. With no alternative, he made the decision to press on towards Steinugelflaget, but at slow pace. Experienced divers well-versed in deep-sea exploration understand that going directly to the surface can cause decompression sickness. Gronkvist knew he would have to spend hours making additional decompression stops before surfacing. Saving his own life, and knowing that the second group would encounter Huotarinen's body, he moved on. Vesa Rantanen, leading the second team, faced a tough decision at the narrow passage. He had to choose between passing the deceased diver or making a lengthy journey back through the deepest section. Rantanen opted to move forward, a decision he considered wise, but it added about 15 minutes to his struggle to get past the lifeless diver. This choice extended his decompression time by an extra 3 hours, eventually reuniting him with Gronkvist. However, Rantanen was forced to surface 80 minutes earlier than planned as he was running low on gas. Soon after, he started experiencing mild pains in his knees and elbows, indicative of decompression sickness, commonly known as the bends. Over the subsequent hours, these symptoms worsened. Later, Rantanen discovered that Jari Uzimaki, the diver behind him, also faced challenges when they reached the site of the initial accident. It is speculated that Uzimaki panicked after he reached the scene of the first accident. The fifth diver, Kai Kankinen, attempted but failed to save Uzimaki. However, Kankinen has mentioned that his memories of exactly what happened are sketchy. What he vividly remembers is that, unlike Vesa Rantanen, Kankinen decided not to push through to Steinugelflaget. Instead, he turned around and swam the long way back to the starting point. He finally emerged from the cave in the early hours of the next day, more than 11 hours after setting off on a dive that was supposed to take 5 hours. To reach the surface at Plura, he had to break through a thin layer of ice. All 3 survivors were hospitalized due to decompression sickness. Following the devastating accident, the recovery of the fallen divers' bodies became a mission of honor for their surviving colleagues. This feeling only increased when an official recovery attempt by a team of experienced British cave divers was called off due to the high risks encountered. Despite the cave being officially closed for further exploration, a large team of experienced Finnish and Norwegian divers planned a second recovery operation in secret. The recovery team included the surviving cave divers. A total of 27 individuals arrived at Plura on March 22, 2014, comprising 17 Finns and 10 Norwegians. 2 teams of support divers were designated to work at shallower levels at both ends of the traverse. Meanwhile, Grönkvist, Pakarinen, and Kankinen prepared for another dive to the deepest section of the cave to retrieve the bodies. Despite recovering from a spinal injury caused by decompression sickness, Vesa took on the role of surface manager during the recovery attempt. The prior cave experience of the second team provided them with an advantage over the initial rescue team. Taking no chances this time, the first step in the 5-day operation involved transporting over a ton of gear into the cave at Steinugelflaget. This gear was gradually winched up a cable to the mountain. A day was spent setting up equipment, placing 50 gas cylinders along the route, and establishing an underwater habitat on the Plura side for decompression stops. This habitat provided divers with a space to escape the cold water, remove their masks, and even eat if necessary. On March 24th, the divers commenced the recovery operation, submerging beneath the icy lid of Plura, accompanied by underwater camera operators. Passing the floating body of Jari Usimaki, they encountered Jari Hotrinen approximately 20 meters further on, exactly as Grönkvist had left him 7 weeks earlier. By cutting away the equipment, they successfully released the body and navigated it through the narrow section of the cave. Grönkvist used a dive scooter to steer towards the surface, towing the body, while Pakarinen followed to assist in maneuvering it. Returning the following day, Grönkvist and Pakarinen, aided by another diver, Jani Santala, retrieved Jari Usimaki's body. This time, the recovery from Steinugelflaget proved more challenging. The body was more buoyant and unwieldy, and Pakarinen faced a close call when a part of the cave collapsed on him. Nevertheless, both victims were lifted to Steinugelflaget, where they were placed in body bags provided by Grönkvist's fire station. The entire operation consumed 101 hours of diving time, concluding with a moment of silence in the beautiful cave. November 1996, 3 professional divers were studying the marine life of the Cane Bay Wall while they were diving near St. Croix. A week ago, they had placed some traps. Today, they planned to gather the samples and perform more measurements. With hundreds of dives under their belts, all 3 of these people were seasoned divers, so the 3 of them had a combined experience of almost 1,000 dives. 2 of the men, Brett and Robbie, started collecting samples as soon as they reached the depth of the traps, which is around 220 feet, or 67 meters. While monitoring their depth and time, Rod, the 3rd man, spotted 2 oceanic white-tip sharks swimming far away along the wall. Since the men were seasoned divers, they were completely fond of this. Sighting sharks is a common occurrence when diving in the ocean. These open-water species were exceptionally enormous, measuring about 14 feet in length, and it was unusual to see them so near to land. Thus, the 3 men took a quick break from their labor to snap a few photos. They worked at depth for the allotted 15 minutes or so, and were around halfway through their dive. This indicated that it was time to return to the surface. In their ascent plan, Robbie would go first, followed by Brett and Rod at the top. Robbie, for some unknown reasons, had been breathing a little bit more during the dive. So as they started to rise, his air reading was a little lower than normal. Brett instructed him to proceed to a shallower depth. Then, Brett started to swim as well, and noticed that Robbie was pointing back down to where Rod was, who was still down on the wall. Gazing downward, Brett observed that Rod was entirely encased in silt, resembling a cloud of dust. Brett thought Rod might have had a hose break, letting air shoot up and kicking up silt on the wall. Brett swam back down to see whether he needed any assistance, as this also meant that he might be leaking air and might need some extra. To his surprise, it wasn't a hose at all. As he entered the silt cloud and obtained a closer look, he made a chilling discovery. Rod had a large bite mark on his leg, which Brett realized while he tried to grab and pull him. While he was processing what he was seeing, the shark came in for another attack, putting them both in a dire situation. Struggling desperately, they attempted to strike the shark's gills to ward it off. During this fierce struggle, a second shark entered the scene, gripping on Rod's calf, causing the silt to become blood red. Shortly after, the first shark returned, clamping onto Rod's thigh with renewed aggression, forcefully dragging him. Even though Brett was pulling hard in the opposite direction, the shark was too strong and pulled the two of them right over the edge of the drop-off. As they plummeted down the wall, practically in a free fall, both of them struggled fiercely against the sharks while rapidly using up the little air they had left. At a point, Brett checked his depth gauge and noticed it maxed out at 325 feet, indicating they were descending beyond its reading capacity. Finally, a brief pause in the shark's attack allowed Brett to pull them into a small sandy cove within the wall. That was where he finally got a clearer picture of Rod's condition. And to his disbelief, he saw that Rod had nearly severed his entire left leg. He also suffered severe bites to his chest and stomach, and the majority of the tissue was gone. His condition was bad, and they had little time. Every wasted second brought his friend closer to his demise. Upon seeing this, Brett basically went into full panic mode and grabbed Rod and started swimming up as hard as he could. But within just a few seconds, the sharks came back and grabbed Rod again, pulling them both back down the wall. And as if things couldn't get any worse, Brett went to take a breath, and it felt like he was pulling the air through a straw. This meant that he had just a few breaths left before he was completely out of air. Then another second later, the sharks ripped Rod right out of his hands, and Brett watched helplessly as they pulled him deeper into the water. Almost out of air now himself, there was just nothing he could do to help Rod anymore, so he had to refocus on saving himself. Unfortunately, he found himself hovering at nearly 400 feet or below the surface, with scant air remaining. In a panicked frenzy, he began a frantic ascent towards the surface. During this ascent, a glance at his depth gauge revealed a persistent red line at 325 feet. Amidst the overwhelming depth, panic, and the onset of nitrogen narcosis, his singular focus was on executing vigorous, rhythmic kicks toward the faint light above. Stroke after stroke, his vision gradually turned into a tunnel-like perspective. As he swam, this tunnel vision got smaller and smaller until he had one final thought, which was that he was so close and that he passed out about 30 feet from the surface. In a stroke of luck, his buoyancy device retained just enough air to elevate him to the surface, allowing his head to emerge from the water. Then, the pressure difference forced him to exhale and kick-started his breathing, and he woke up gasping for air. Taking a moment to survey his surroundings and grasp the sequence of events, he realized the grim reality. Robbie, the third team member, had already departed to seek assistance. The haunting image of both of them disappearing over the wall, drenched in blood, convinced Robbie to assume the worst and urgently seek help. Emerging from the profound depths, Brett's rapid ascent triggered the onset of decompression sickness. The urgency to reach the shore gripped him, knowing that any delay risked unconsciousness or even paralysis. Reaching shallow waters, he quickly took off his scuba gear and sprinted towards the nearest couple on the beach. In a breathless disclosure, he identified himself and explained his condition: decompression sickness. Urgently, he provided details about his truck, the location of his keys, and the presence of emergency instructions on the dashboard. As he concluded these critical instructions, Brett dropped unconscious once again. Luckily, fate was on his side as fortune favored Brett. The couple he encountered happened to be a doctor and a nurse, well-versed in decompression sickness. Rushing to his truck, they retrieved the instructions and swiftly made their way to a nearby hotel's phone. Because there were no decompression chambers on the island, they notified the marine lab where he worked, and they swiftly dispatched a medevac plane to retrieve him. From there, he was taken from St. Croix and flown to Puerto Rico. In a surreal turn of events, the plane faced an oxygen shortage, necessitating an emergency landing on a highway. The sequence continued with a coordinated helicopter landing to cover the remaining distance to the hospital. Finally admitted, Brett began his journey towards an almost full recovery, with some enduring effects from the decompression sickness. Regrettably, Rod's body has never been recovered.
Give this video a thumbs up and comment down below if you enjoyed the video. It will help in boosting our videos in the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe for more disaster videos. We will see you next time.